Hello, here's our supplementary lecture this week on populations. We've been talking a lot about populations in this class, specifically the buffalo population in the Serengeti. Today we'll talk about some other animal populations and take a look at what researchers might study, ecologists who might be interested in managing these animal populations. First of all, we need to know where the organisms live, their geographic range. What's their historic range? What's their current range? Another thing we're going to talk about today is something called density distribution, the growth rate of the population, and the age structure. So here's a picture of the historic and current range of Rocky Mountain elk, although there are some other subspecies of elk in the Pacific Northwest. Some of them have gone extinct, but Rocky Mountain elk is just one of the subspecies. And you can see as you look at this graphic that historically we used to find elk in the Midwest all over North America, and now the red or the current range is dramatically reduced. So what this coincides with is the westward expansion of humans across North America and the reduction of elk habitat. Now, it's not that the elk couldn't survive there, but they simply just can't coexist with human agriculture and things like that. So they've been pushed into places like mountain ranges, and these red dots align pretty closely with various mountain ranges across the West. One of the ones that sticks out to me is there's almost a little comma-shaped mountain range there, the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming. It's a complete island surrounded by prairie and badlands, and then this high elevation area is home to a healthy population of elk. So how about can we apply this to humans? Sure, we can. Humans are organisms on planet Earth, and ecologists want to study humans as well as animal populations. So this map shows a population density in people per square mile. And you can see by looking at this graphic here where most of the people are in the world and where they're most densely populated. Even though the United States has around 300 million people, look at how most of the people are found on the eastern half of the United States. And there's some historical reasons for that. And the West is a vast, empty place for the most part. Even though we live in a city here in Helena, people out east would consider Helena to be a small town by comparison. High human population here in Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa. Europe, of course, is ancient civilization, and really the cradle of civilization here, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So history plays into this and how humans have spread across planet Earth. I want to point out India and China, the two most populous nations on planet Earth. And notice how most of the people in China are pretty much on the eastern side of the country. Any idea what this western side of China is? Well, let me tell you, it's a giant desert, one of the great deserts of the world, pretty inhospitable to humans. A large part of this region is known as the Gobi Desert. India is pretty much crammed with people from every corner. Crazy. Even in like the Himalayas, there's people living up into the foothills. So we might also take a look at the age structure. The age structure is shown usually as this population pyramid that gives you a sense of the relative abundance of different age groups. As you can see, the age group structure tells us whether or not that population is growing rapidly or growing slowly. We have a lot of reproductively viable people at the bottom of the pyramid here. We expect rapid growth. So this applies not only to human populations, but also animal populations too. If we have a population of buffalo, for example, with a large number of those buffalo are young, healthy, and reproductively viable, we expect the population to grow. Pretty common sense stuff. Density distribution. So this starts to get a little bit more specific on how we examine where organisms live in the context of their environment? Do they scatter out? Do they stick together? Um, what would cause these sorts of things? Different organisms have different life history strategies to survive, and these distribution patterns that we see are kind of relics of that. Um, See if you can imagine or think about an example of an organism right now that might exhibit a random distribution pattern. So instead of like the human population where we have kind of density focused in cities, what type of organism would be randomly scattered throughout, not really tied to any one place? That was your thinking time? Awkward moment of silence. I'm thinking about some sort of grass populations and even something like dandelions. So mostly plants that their seed dispersal is driven by wind or other organisms, and they uh, they spread randomly, and wherever they seem to end up, they can be successful. And not all the time. Sometimes where they land plays a big factor in whether or not they grow or not. But that would definitely be a decent example. Uniform would be, well, I think I have some examples actually down here a little further. Maybe not. Guess I have to go back. Okay, uniform would be evenly spaced in the environment. So um, a good example of that would be crops in a field that are planted in rows. So we have some human influence there. Clumped would be kind of humans, and a lot of animals are clumped. They like to live in groups, herds with other animals for protection, warmth, things like that. And if you want to, you can model this, but that's generally from previous years. So how do we know what the density of organisms is in a specific area? Well, we need to know the number of individuals, and we also need to know the area. This is the same thing you did in earth science, density calculations for earth processes. This is just using that same concept for animal populations or plant populations, and we need to count the number of individuals and divide by the area. Um, Typically, our area in the biological science is going to be something called a hectare, which is the metric unit of area. So with populations, they can grow a couple different ways. A couple terms you guys are going to need to know here. Number one would be exponential growth. And this is what we expect for, let's say, a bacteria population that has unlimited food supplies and just grows out of control. Their generation time is very rapid, and we expect what's called a J-shaped curve on a population graph of population versus time. Logistic growth, it incorporates the carrying capacity that we've talked about. As resources start to limit population, the growth slows and we develop more of an S-shaped curve. So here's the J-shaped exponential growth curve. As time increases, we have more organisms that can then have babies and more organisms that can then have babies. And you can see how this is an accelerating process of reproduction. And the coronavirus is spread is a good example of exponential growth in a population. And we're hoping that it levels off soon and resembles more of a logistic model. So I had an example that I've worked through in the past. I'm going to skip through that and focus on factors that might limit the population growth for a group of organisms. So if the organisms are able, they can come and go, so they can immigrate or emigrate. Immigrant is the coming, emigrate is the going. And then we also need to know the birth rate of the population and the death rate, and we could figure out what the intrinsic growth rate of the population would be and be able to do some math and predict populations in the future given some parameters, much like the model we've been using in class to model our buffalo populations. So here's the S-shaped curve that represents logistic growth. This dotted line is really important. That's called the carrying capacity. And that's set by some of those limiting factors we just talked about. Um, Availability of resources, food, space, competition, disease, all of those types of things can limit the animal's ability to grow in the environment. And so this is typically what we see with most organisms. We're probably wondering now with the buffalo population we've been studying if we're going to start to see a growth rate decrease after we had that unexplained increase, which we're still trying to find out the cause. So what are some limiting factors going to be? I just mentioned those. Were you paying attention? Why don't you write a couple down right now before I go on to the next slide? Too slow. Competition, predation, parasitism, disease, weather, disasters. And then we can say, well, which one of these are density dependent or density independent? What that refers to is, does the number of organisms affect their susceptibility to the limiting factors? So for example, with disease we would say is a density dependent factor. The higher the population density, the more likely disease would come in and wreak havoc on the ecosystem. Density independent would be something more like unusual weather or disaster, maybe a chance event that may or may not hit the population and doesn't really have to do so much with the density of the population. So human growth, human population growth is a big question for ecologists and environmental scientists, and we want to know when we're going to reach our carrying capacity on planet Earth. There's some cool YouTube videos you can watch which model the population growth of humans, and we've really been growing exponentially for quite some time. And some people think that we're going to run out of space on planet Earth, and our ability to grow food is going to limit our ability to continue the exponential growth that we observe. And another thing to mention here with coronavirus is that our density dependent limiting factor of disease is possibly um, playing a role in not really limiting population growth, but definitely affecting it slightly. There's just so many people that even though coronavirus is so deadly, ultimately it's not going to dramatically reduce global human population numbers. So it would have to be a much worse disease and literally wipe out millions or even billions of people to make much of an impact. So that's the end of my presentation, and I hope you learned something. Make sure you're writing down some questions that you have and send me those questions via email if you're DLI, or bring them to class and we'll discuss. Have a nice day.